She traveled with her worst enemy, and the millionaire made her sleep next to him in bed. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. She could feel his eyes burning into the back of her head before she even turned around. Camille Johnson adjusted her black blazer with practiced precision, her dark skin glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room. At 28, she had learned to armor herself with confidence, every gesture deliberate, every word calculated. In the cutthroat world of luxury event planning in Los Angeles, weakness was a luxury she couldn't afford. "The Henderson wedding needs to be flawless," she said, her voice carrying across the marble-topped table to her team of 5 coordinators. 300 guests, a $2 million budget, and 0 room for error. Her fingers traced the edge of the contract as she spoke, each word measured. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Prestige Events' downtown office, casting long shadows across the polished surfaces. This was her domain, a world where she controlled every detail, where her reputation for turning chaos into perfection preceded her. "What about the Drake Industries sponsorship?" asked Melissa, her assistant, glancing nervously at her tablet. "The meeting is scheduled for 10:30, Camille finished, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Just the mention of that name was enough to make her pulse quicken, not with excitement, but with the familiar surge of irritation that had become her body's automatic response over the past year. Ethan Drake. Even thinking his name left a bitter taste in her mouth. She had first encountered him 18 months ago at a charity gala. Her event, his money. What should have been a straightforward business relationship had somehow devolved into a pattern of professional warfare that neither of them seemed capable of ending. The man was insufferable, arrogant in that particular way that only came with generational wealth and the assumption that the world existed solely for his convenience. At 37, Ethan Drake had built his investment empire on calculated risks and cold negotiations, treating every interaction like a chess match he was destined to win. "Ms. Johnson," Melissa's voice pulled her back to the present. "Should I reschedule the Drake meeting? You look like you'd rather face a firing squad." Camille's laugh was sharp, professional. "Nothing I can't handle." She gathered her papers with movements that betrayed none of her inner turmoil. "I've been dealing with difficult clients since I was 22. One more won't break me." But as she walked toward the conference room where Ethan Drake waited, Camille couldn't shake the memory of their last encounter, 3 weeks ago, at the Beverly Hills Hotel. He had questioned every aspect of her proposal for his company's annual investor dinner, his steel-gray eyes picking apart her presentation with surgical precision. "Are you suggesting we spend $40,000 on floral arrangements?" he had asked, leaning back in his chair with that infuriating half-smile that suggested he found her personally amusing. "I'm suggesting we create an atmosphere worthy of your investors' expectations," she had replied, her voice honey-sweet with professional venom. "Or maybe you just like expensive flowers." The memory still made her jaw clench. The man had a talent for making her feel simultaneously invisible and overly scrutinized, as if she were some fascinating creature in a zoo exhibit designed specifically for his entertainment. Now, as she approached the conference room, she caught a glimpse of him through the glass doors. Ethan Drake sat with his back to her, his dark hair slightly mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, probably costing more than most people's monthly rent. Even from behind, he radiated that particular brand of confidence that came from never having to worry about anything as mundane as money or consequences. Camille paused outside the door, taking a breath that had nothing to do with nervousness and everything to do with preparation. This was just another battle in their ongoing war, another opportunity to prove that she was more than capable of handling whatever psychological games he chose to play. She pushed open the door with more force than necessary. "Mr. Drake," she said, her voice carrying just enough warmth to be professional and just enough ice to maintain distance. "I hope you haven't been waiting long." He turned in his chair, and for a moment, just a heartbeat, something flickered across his features, something that looked almost like relief, quickly masked by his usual expression of controlled amusement. "Ms. Johnson." His voice was deeper than she remembered, carrying a hint of something she couldn't quite identify. "Actually, I've been enjoying the view." Through the windows, downtown Los Angeles stretched out in all its complicated glory, glass towers reaching toward a hazy sky, the distant mountains barely visible through the smog. But when Camille looked at Ethan, she realized he wasn't looking at the cityscape at all. He was looking at her. "Well," she said, settling into the chair across from him with deliberate grace. "Let's discuss the Las Vegas project." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge, and for the first time in 18 months of professional warfare, Camille wondered if she was truly prepared for whatever came next. Something had changed in his expression, something subtle but unmistakable, and as she opened her portfolio to begin their meeting, one thought echoed in her mind with uncomfortable persistence. This time feels different, but she had no way of knowing just how different it would be. Have you ever felt that tension with someone you should hate, but who awakens something inexplicable in you? That kind of person who manages to irritate and fascinate you at the same time? "You want me to do what now?" Camille stared at her boss, Vivian Blackwell, as if the woman had just suggested she jump off the Hollywood sign. The corner office of Prestige Events suddenly felt smaller, the afternoon sun casting harsh shadows across the minimalist decor. Las Vegas, Camille. 5 days. The International Luxury Summit. Vivian's perfectly manicured fingers drummed against her glass desk, each tap echoing like a countdown. 300 of the world's wealthiest investors, and Ethan Drake is the keynote sponsor. The words hit Camille like ice water. She had been expecting a challenging assignment, maybe the governor's anniversary party or another celebrity wedding with impossible demands. Not this. Never this. "There has to be someone else," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Natalie has experience with international events, and Bedford is recovering from surgery, and Natalie is handling the Morrison wedding." Vivian leaned back in her chair, studying Camille with the calculating gaze of someone who had built her empire on reading people's weaknesses. "Besides, Drake specifically requested you." The room fell silent, except for the distant hum of Los Angeles traffic 20 floors below. Camille felt something cold settle in her stomach, a mixture of dread and something else she refused to acknowledge. "He requested me." The question came out sharper than she intended. His exact words were, "I want someone who won't back down from a challenge." Vivian's smile was razor-thin. "Apparently your professional dynamic impressed him." Professional dynamic. As if their barely contained animosity was some kind of business strategy, rather than a year and a half of genuine mutual irritation. Camille stood up, pacing to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city she had conquered one event at a time. Down there, people were living normal lives, commuting home, picking up groceries, calling their families. Simple, uncomplicated lives that didn't involve being trapped in the desert with men who seemed to exist solely to test her patience. "The Bellagio has already confirmed the venue," Vivian continued, interpreting Camille's silence as acceptance. "Presidential suite for accommodations, first-class flights, unlimited budget for the event itself. It's a career-making opportunity. And if I say no, then Hartwell and Associates gets the contract, and we lose our biggest client." Vivian's voice carried the weight of an ultimatum wrapped in silk. "Your choice, Camille." But they both knew it wasn't really a choice at all. 20 minutes later, Camille sat in her office, staring at the boarding passes that had somehow materialized on her desk with frightening efficiency. Flight 447 to Las Vegas, departing Thursday morning. First class, window seat. The seat assignment next to hers was conspicuously blank, but she had a sinking suspicion she knew who would be occupying 2B. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, but the arrogance was unmistakable. "Looking forward to working together, Ms. Johnson. Try not to overthink the accommodations. ED." Accommodations? What did that mean? Before she could spiral into worst-case scenarios, her assistant knocked on the door. "Camille, there's been a mix-up with the hotel reservations." The cold feeling in her stomach turned to ice. What kind of mix-up? Well, apparently there was a booking error. The summit reserved the entire presidential floor, but they only have one suite available for the Prestige Events team. Melissa's voice was carefully neutral, the tone of someone delivering bad news to a person known for shooting messengers. "One suite." Camille repeated the words slowly, as if saying them louder might change their meaning. "With, one bedroom." The silence stretched between them, until Melissa cleared her throat nervously. "Mr. Drake's assistant called to confirm he'd received the same information. He said to tell you, and I quote, not to worry about it." Camille closed her eyes, counting to 10 in 3 different languages, a stress management technique she'd picked up during her early days in event planning. It had worked for bridezillas and temperamental celebrities, but somehow felt inadequate for whatever psychological warfare Ethan Drake was orchestrating. "There have to be other hotels," she said finally. "During the International Luxury Summit, Melissa's tone suggested Camille had temporarily lost her mind. Every five-star hotel in Vegas has been booked for months. I checked. The closest available room is at a budget motel an hour outside the city. The image flashed through Camille's mind, trying to coordinate a multi-million-dollar event from a roadside motel with questionable Wi-Fi and thin walls. Her reputation would survive many things, but professional humiliation wasn't one of them. Fine. The word came out harder than she intended. Fine. Book the suite. I'll figure out the sleeping arrangements when I get there. After Melissa left, Camille sat alone in her office as the sun set over Los Angeles, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded her of the desert sunsets she'd soon be seeing. She tried to focus on the logistics of the event, catering for 300 audio-visual requirements, transportation coordination, anything except the growing certainty that the next 5 days would test every professional boundary she'd spent years constructing. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from the same unknown number. "Don't worry, Ms. Johnson, I don't bite unless you ask nicely." Camille stared at the message until the words blurred, heat rising in her cheeks that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with a treacherous flutter of anticipation she absolutely refused to acknowledge. She typed back quickly, "Professional conduct will be maintained at all times, Mr. Drake." His response came immediately. "Of course. Wouldn't dream of anything else." But something in those words, even filtered through the cold distance of text messaging, carried a promise that made her pulse quicken in ways she didn't want to examine too closely. As she gathered her things to leave the office, one thought echoed in her mind with uncomfortable persistence. 5 days in Las Vegas with Ethan Drake in a single suite. What could possibly go wrong? The first-class cabin of Flight 447 hummed with the quiet efficiency of wealth and privilege, but Camille felt anything but comfortable as she settled into seat 2A. Her burgundy leather carry-on was stowed overhead, her tablet loaded with venue layouts and vendor contracts, and her game face firmly in place. She had arrived at LAX precisely 43 minutes before boarding, early enough to appear professional, late enough to avoid awkward small talk in the gate area. The strategy had worked perfectly until she heard that familiar voice behind her in the boarding line. "Ms. Johnson, right on time." She had turned to find Ethan Drake looking unfairly put together for 6 in the morning, his charcoal travel suit somehow resistant to wrinkles, and his dark hair styled with the kind of casual precision that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. He carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never waited in a security line or worried about baggage fees. Now, as the plane taxied toward the runway, she was acutely aware of his presence in seat 2B. He had claimed the aisle seat without asking, settling in with the practiced ease of someone who flew first class the way most people took city buses. His cologne, something expensive and subtly masculine, drifted over the narrow space between them every time he moved. Coffee. The flight attendant, a polished woman named Cordelia, appeared with a warm smile and a silver tray. "We have a signature blend from Sumatra, or perhaps something lighter." "The Sumatra, please," Camille replied, grateful for the distraction. "Black." "Make that too," Ethan added, and she felt rather than saw his glance in her direction. "Seems we have similar tastes." Camille accepted her coffee with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just a coincidence, I'm sure." The plane lifted off with the smooth power of first-class engineering, Los Angeles shrinking to a grid of lights below them. Camille had made this flight dozens of times for various events, but somehow the familiar routine felt different with Ethan Drake occupying the space beside her. She pulled out her tablet, determined to focus on work. The International Luxury Summit required coordination between 12 different vendors, 3 entertainment acts, and a guest list that read like a Forbes 500 directory. Every detail needed to be perfect, especially with her professional nemesis watching her every move. "The Bellagio ballroom can accommodate the full guest list," she murmured, scrolling through her notes. "But we'll need to reconfigure the stage for the keynote presentation." "The acoustics are better with the stage centered," Ethan said without looking up from his own tablet. "I've spoken there before." Camille paused, her finger hovering over the screen. She hadn't asked for his input, but the information was admittedly useful. "You've given keynotes at the summit before. 3 years running." He glanced at her then, something unreadable in his steel-grey eyes. "This is your first time coordinating it?" The question held no mockery, but Camille felt defensive anyway. "Prestige Events has handled international summits before. I coordinated the Global Finance Forum in Monaco last year." "Monaco," he repeated, and there was something almost like approval in his voice. "That was your event? Impressive. The logistics alone must have been a nightmare." The unexpected compliment caught her off guard. In 18 months of professional warfare, Ethan Drake had never acknowledged her competence, let alone praised it. She found herself studying his profile as he returned to his tablet, noting the sharp line of his jaw and the way his fingers moved across the screen with surprising grace. "You were there?" she asked, curiosity overriding caution. "Observer only. But I remember thinking whoever coordinated that event understood how to manage chaos." He looked at her again, and this time his expression was almost respectful. "I had no idea it was you." The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, and Camille's coffee cup rattled against her tray table. Outside the window, Nevada stretched endlessly below them, all red rock and impossible distances. The movement made her stomach lurch, though whether from the altitude or the strange shift in Ethan's demeanor, she couldn't say. "Are you all right?" His voice was closer now, and she realized he had leaned toward her, one hand reaching out as if to steady her. "I'm fine," she said quickly, but her voice sounded breathless even to her own ears. "Just turbulence." But he didn't move away. For a moment that lasted too long and not long enough, they were close enough that she could see the small scar above his left eyebrow, could count the dark lashes that framed his too perceptive eyes, close enough to notice that his cologne carried hints of cedar and something else, something that made her think of expensive hotels and crisp white sheets. "You know," he said, his voice lower than before, "we're going to be working closely for the next 5 days. Maybe we could call a temporary truce?" The words hung between them in the recycled air of the cabin. Camille was aware of Cordelia moving discreetly down the aisle, of the businessman across from them, tapping away at his laptop, of the steady hum of engines carrying them toward whatever waited in Las Vegas. But all of that felt distant compared to the man beside her, whose presence seemed to fill the space between them with an electricity she didn't want to acknowledge. "A truce," she repeated slowly, "just for the duration of the summit." His lips curved in something that wasn't quite his usual smirk. "I promise to behave if you do." There was something in his tone that suggested multiple interpretations of the word behave, and Camille felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the cabin temperature. "I always behave professionally, Mr. Drake." "Ethan," he corrected. "If we're calling a truce, you might as well use my name." The plane shuddered again, more violently this time, and suddenly his hand was covering hers on the armrest. His fingers were warm and surprisingly gentle, and the contact sent an unwelcome jolt of awareness through her entire body. "Sorry," he said, but he didn't pull away immediately. Instinct. Camille stared down at their joined hands, her dark skin against his lighter tone, her delicate fingers dwarfed by his broader ones. The sight did something strange to her breathing. "Ethan," she said finally, testing the shape of his name in her mouth. It felt different without the formal distance of Mr. Drake. More intimate, more dangerous. "Better," he said, and his thumb traced once across her knuckles before he withdrew his hand. The gesture was so brief she might have imagined it, but the warmth lingered long after the contact ended. As the plane began its descent toward Las Vegas, Camille found herself wondering if agreeing to a truce had been the smartest decision of her career, or the most dangerous. The Bellagio's presidential suite was a monument to excess and elegance, but all Camille could focus on was the singular king-sized bed dominating the master bedroom. "There seems to be some confusion," she said to Rosalind, the impeccably dressed concierge who had escorted them upstairs. Her voice carried the careful politeness of someone trying very hard not to lose her composure in public. "No confusion at all, Ms. Johnson," Rosalind replied with the smooth efficiency of someone who had dealt with far stranger requests from wealthy guests. The presidential suite was booked specifically for the Drake Industries and Prestige Events collaboration. One suite, as requested. Camille's luggage sat beside the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Strip, looking innocent and unassuming. Ethan's matching leather set was positioned near the marble-topped bar, as if their belongings had already decided to cohabitate, while their owners worked through the logistics. "I'm sure there's been some mistake," Camille continued, but Rosalind was already shaking her head. "I have the confirmation right here," she said, producing a tablet with the booking details. "Requested by Mr. Drake's assistant 3 weeks ago. Specifically noted, Prestige Events Coordination Team requires accommodation in Presidential Suite for optimal project management." Camille turned to look at Ethan, who was standing by the wet bar examining a bottle of champagne with suspicious nonchalance. The afternoon Las Vegas sun streamed through the windows, casting golden highlights in his dark hair and making his perfectly tailored shirt look like it belonged in a luxury magazine spread. "Your assistant made this booking?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Kendra is very thorough," he replied without looking up from the champagne label. "She believes in efficient resource allocation." Efficient resource allocation. Camille repeated the words slowly, tasting their corporate blandness. "Is that what we're calling this?" Rosalind cleared her throat delicately. "If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to call. The suite comes with 24-hour concierge service, private dining, and exclusive access to the spa level." She paused at the door, her smile professionally warm. "Oh, and congratulations on your collaboration. The hotel staff is very excited to support such a dynamic partnership." The door closed with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Camille walked to the massive windows, her heels clicking against the marble floor with military precision. Below them, Las Vegas sprawled in all its glittering artificial glory, a city built on the premise that reality was negotiable and anything could happen if you were willing to bet on it. "The couch looks comfortable," Ethan said behind her. She turned to find him leaning against the doorframe that led to the bedroom, his expression unreadable. The late afternoon light caught the grey flecks in his eyes, making them look almost silver. "I'm not sleeping on the couch," she said immediately. "I wasn't suggesting you should." His voice carried that hint of amusement that had irritated her for 18 months, but somehow sounded different now. Less mocking, more fond. "I was offering to take it myself." The offer surprised her. In all their professional encounters, Ethan Drake had never been particularly chivalrous. Ruthlessly fair in business dealings, yes. Unexpectedly generous with charity donations, certainly. But considerate of her personal comfort, that was new territory. "That's unnecessary," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure why she was refusing his offer. Pride, maybe. Or the growing suspicion that sleeping in the same room as Ethan Drake, even with the considerable distance of a California king between them, might prove more dangerous to her peace of mind than sharing a hotel suite. "The bed is large enough for 2 adults to maintain appropriate boundaries," she continued, the words coming out more formal than she intended. "We're both professionals. We can handle this maturely." Something flickered across his expression. Surprise, maybe, or something else entirely. "Are you sure? Because I have to warn you, I've been told I talk in my sleep." "What do you say?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately regretted the curiosity in her voice. "Trade secrets, mostly. Stock tips. The occasional confession of corporate malfeasance." His lips curved in the first genuine smile she'd seen from him all day. "Nothing you could use against me in court." Despite herself, Camille felt her own mouth twitch toward a smile. How disappointing. "I was hoping for embarrassing childhood memories or secret phobias." "Who says those aren't trade secrets?" The moment stretched between them, filled with something that felt dangerously close to actual conversation rather than their usual verbal sparring. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made the suite feel warmer, more intimate. Camille's phone buzzed, breaking the spell. A text from Vivian. "How's Vegas? Hope you and Drake are playing nicely together." The words on the screen seemed to mock her current situation. Playing nicely. If only Vivian knew how complicated nicely had become in the space of a single afternoon. "Work?" Ethan asked, and she realized he had moved closer while she was reading. "My boss checking in." She slipped the phone back into her purse. "I should review the vendor contracts for tomorrow's setup meeting." Of course. But he didn't move away. Instead, he studied her face with that intensity that had always made her uncomfortable. "You know, I've been wondering something." "What?" "Why do you hate me so much?" The question was so unexpected, so direct, that Camille felt momentarily off balance. In 18 months of professional warfare, neither of them had ever acknowledged their mutual animosity so plainly. "I don't hate you," she said automatically, then stopped, because that wasn't entirely true, was it? The emotion she felt toward Ethan Drake was complicated, layered with frustration, and something else she didn't want to examine too closely. "So you don't?" His eyebrows rose slightly. "Because there have been times the Henderson wedding planning meeting comes to mind, when I was fairly certain you were plotting my professional demise." The memory made her wince. She had been particularly sharp that day, questioning every suggestion he made with surgical precision. But he had started it, arriving 20 minutes late, and then suggesting they scrap her entire catering plan in favor of something more sophisticated. "You can be Challenging to work with, she said diplomatically. Challenging. He seemed to consider the word. That's one way to put it. What would you call it? Honestly? He was close enough now that she could see the small laugh lines around his eyes, could catch the faint scent of his cologne mixed with something else. Coffee from the plane, maybe, or the desert air that seemed to permeate everything in Las Vegas. I think I've been testing you. Testing me. The words came out sharper than she intended. Every meeting, every project, seeing how far I could push before you pushed back. His expression was serious now, almost contemplative. You never backed down. Not once. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Camille stared at him, processing this revelation. You've been deliberately provoking me for over a year, as some kind of test. Not exactly. He ran a hand through his hair, messing the perfect styling in a way that made him look younger, more approachable. More like, I couldn't figure out how to talk to you normally, so I defaulted to the only interaction that guaranteed a response. The admission hung between them in the golden light of the Vegas sunset, changing something fundamental about every encounter they'd ever had. All those meetings where she'd thought he was being deliberately difficult, all those times she'd gone home frustrated and angry, wondering why he seemed to single her out for particularly intense scrutiny. He had been trying to get her attention. She started, then stopped, because she wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. Pathetic, he suggested. Immature? Counterproductive? I was going to say complicated. Yeah, he said quietly. That's one word for it. The suite fell silent, except for the distant sounds of Las Vegas. Traffic, construction, the eternal hum of a city that never slept. And somewhere in that silence, Camille realized that everything she thought she knew about Ethan Drake had just shifted, leaving her standing on uncertain ground with a man who was suddenly dangerously much more interesting than the enemy she'd been fighting for 18 months. The vendor meeting at 7 a.m. should have gone smoothly, but nothing about Las Vegas was proving to be smooth for Camille Johnson. The floral arrangements are completely wrong, declared Isadora Castellini, the event designer whose reputation for perfectionism was matched only by her talent for dramatic pronouncements. She gestured wildly at the mock-up centerpieces arranged on the Bellagio ballroom's pristine tables. These roses are burgundy, not deep crimson. The entire color palette is ruined. Camille stood in the center of the cavernous ballroom, her black coffee growing cold in her hand, as she surveyed what should have been a simple setup meeting spiraling into chaos. Around her, 23 vendors bustled with varying degrees of panic, their voices echoing off the ornate ceiling in a symphony of professional crisis. The lighting designer says the burgundy actually works better with the amber uplighting, offered Timothy, her assistant coordinator, who had flown in that morning specifically for this disaster. His clipboard was covered in frantic notes, and sweat beaded his forehead despite the ballroom's aggressive air conditioning. I don't care what the lighting designer says, Isadora snapped. I've been creating luxury events since before that man learned what a color wheel was. Camille closed her eyes briefly, drawing on every technique she'd learned for managing chaos. The International Luxury Summit was less than 36 hours away. 300 of the world's wealthiest investors would be arriving throughout the day, expecting an event that justified the $10,000 ticket price, and currently, half her vendors were on the verge of artistic rebellion. Where's the backup floral order? She asked Timothy, her voice cutting through the din with practiced authority. Delayed. Flight issues from Portland. They might arrive by noon, but might isn't good enough. Camille pulled out her phone, already scrolling through her emergency contacts. In 5 years of coordinating luxury events, she had learned that might was a 4-letter word that could destroy reputations. Get me Fontaine Gardens in Beverly Hills. Tell them it's a code-red emergency, and I need 200 centerpieces delivered to Las Vegas before 6 p.m. That'll cost, I don't care what it costs. The words came out harder than she intended, but stress was starting to fray the edges of her professional composure. Bill it to the contingency fund. As Timothy scurried away, phone already pressed to his ear, Camille became aware of someone watching her from the ballroom's entrance. She turned to find Ethan leaning against the doorframe, his charcoal suit immaculate despite the early hour. He had been observing her crisis management with the kind of focus that made her skin prickle with awareness. Rough morning? He asked, approaching with the confident stride of someone who had never faced a floral emergency in his life. Nothing I can't handle, she replied automatically, though the exhaustion in her voice betrayed her. She had been awake since 4 a.m., reviewing contracts and confirming details that should have been settled weeks ago. Of course not. But instead of his usual smirk, his expression held something like genuine concern. "You look like you haven't slept." "I got a few hours. 3, to be exact." She had spent most of the night acutely aware of Ethan's presence in the bed beside her, listening to his steady breathing and trying to ignore the way the California king suddenly felt intimate rather than spacious. He had kept his word about maintaining boundaries, staying carefully on his side of the massive bed. But boundaries were useless against the awareness that had hummed through her body every time he shifted in his sleep, every time the expensive hotel sheets rustled with his movement. "The audio-visual team is here," she continued, focusing on her tablet to avoid meeting his eyes. "They need to do sound checks before the catering setup begins at noon." "Camille." His voice was closer now, and she realized he had moved to stand directly in front of her. When she looked up, his steel-gray eyes held an intensity that made her breath catch. "You're running yourself into the ground. I'm doing my job. Your job doesn't require you to solve every problem personally." He gestured toward the ballroom, where Timothy was gesticulating wildly into his phone, while Isadora continued her artistic tantrum near the stage. "You have a team. Use them." The suggestion was logical, reasonable, and completely beside the point. "This is my event, my reputation. If something goes wrong, then we'll fix it. Together." The word "together" hung between them with unexpected weight. "You don't have to carry everything alone." For a moment, Camille found herself actually considering his offer. The idea of sharing the crushing weight of responsibility was so tempting, it made her chest ache. But partnership required trust, and trust was dangerous territory, with a man who had spent 18 months disrupting her professional equilibrium. "I appreciate the offer," she said finally, "but I've got this under control." "Do you?" His eyebrows rose slightly. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're about to collapse." "I don't collapse." The words came out with more vehemence than she intended, drawing curious glances from nearby vendors. Ethan studied her face for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing more than she wanted to reveal. The careful makeup that couldn't quite hide the shadows under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands, from too much caffeine and too little sleep, the way she held herself, with the rigid posture of someone who refused to show weakness. "When was the last time you ate something?" he asked quietly. The question caught her off guard. "I had coffee." "Coffee isn't food." Without waiting for her response, he pulled out his phone. "Dahlia, it's Ethan. I need you to send breakfast to the Bellagio ballroom, something substantial. For 2. He paused, listening. "Yes, I know it's last minute. That's why I'm calling you instead of room service." "You don't need to," Camille started, but he held up a hand. 20 minutes, he said into the phone. "Perfect, thank you." He ended the call and turned back to her. "Dahlia Montrose runs the best catering service in Vegas. She owes me a favor from a merger I helped finance last year." "Ethan, I really don't have time for—" "You're going to eat," he said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "And then you're going to delegate 3 of these crises to your team. And then you're going to take a 15-minute break." "I don't need a break." "Yes, you do." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the small worry lines around his eyes, could catch the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with the desert air drifting through the ballroom's opened doors. "You're brilliant at what you do, Camille, but you're also human." The unexpected gentleness in his voice did something strange to her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had spent so many months thinking of Ethan Drake as her professional adversary that she had forgotten he was also a man who apparently noticed when she was pushing herself too hard. "Why do you care?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, vulnerable and raw in a way that made her immediately regret asking. He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Around them, the controlled chaos of event preparation continued. Vendors arguing about table linens, technicians testing microphone levels, Timothy still negotiating desperately with the floral emergency contact. But in the small space between them, everything felt still and suspended. "Because," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "watching you burn yourself out is the most painful thing I've experienced in a very long time." The admission hit her like a physical blow. All her careful defenses, all the professional boundaries she had constructed over 5 years of proving herself in a ruthless industry, suddenly felt fragile as spun glass. "Ethan." "Ms. Johnson?" Timothy's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "I've got Fontaine Gardens on the line, but they need to speak with you directly about the delivery logistics." Reality crashed back in a wave of vendor emergencies and ticking clocks. Camille took the phone from Timothy's outstretched hand but she could feel Ethan's gaze on her like a physical touch as she turned away to handle the crisis. When she finished the call 10 minutes later, breakfast had arrived, an elegant spread of fresh fruit, artisanal pastries, and what looked like the most perfectly prepared scrambled eggs she had ever seen. Ethan was standing beside the impromptu meal setup, holding a plate that he handed to her without comment. "Thank you," she said quietly, accepting the food that she hadn't realized she desperately needed. "Thank me by eating it," he replied, "and by letting me help with whatever crisis erupts next." As Camille took her first bite of the eggs, which were impossibly exactly as perfect as they looked, she realized that somewhere between the floral emergency and the breakfast intervention, something fundamental had shifted between them. And for the first time in 18 months, the idea of Ethan Drake helping her with anything didn't feel like a threat to her independence. It felt like relief. The International Luxury Summit was a triumph, and Camille Johnson had never felt more exhausted in her life. At 11:30 p.m., the Bellagio ballroom finally fell silent after 8 hours of seamless execution. 300 of the world's wealthiest investors had dined on five-star cuisine, applauded keynote presentations, and networked among floral arrangements that had cost more than most people's annual salaries. The emergency roses from Fontaine Gardens had been perfect, so perfect that Isadora Castellini had actually apologized for her morning tantrum. Now, as the last vendor packed away the final champagne flute, Camille stood in the empty ballroom and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of satisfaction. The event had been flawless. Not a single detail had gone unnoticed. Not a single guest had left unsatisfied. Her reputation was not only intact, it was enhanced. "You did it." Ethan's voice came from behind her, warm with something that sounded dangerously close to pride. She turned to find him approaching across the now empty dance floor, his bow tie loosened and his formal jacket slung over one arm. The evening had transformed him from the controlled businessman she knew into something more approachable, more human. His dark hair was slightly mussed from the long day, and there was a relaxed satisfaction in his posture that she had never seen before. "We did it," she corrected, surprising herself with the admission. Throughout the day, Ethan had been quietly invaluable, handling vendor disputes with the kind of calm authority that came from years of high-stakes negotiations, charming difficult guests with the effortless social skills that money and breeding provided, appearing exactly where she needed him without being asked. "The presentation went well?" she asked, settling onto one of the plush velvet chairs that surrounded the now cleared tables. "Better than well." He claimed the chair beside her, close enough that she could see the satisfaction in his steel-gray eyes. Henderson Industries committed to a $12 million investment, and at least 6 other firms expressed serious interest in the tech portfolio. $12 million? Camille felt her eyebrows rise. Even in her world of luxury events, $12 million was serious money. "Apparently, your event coordination created the exact atmosphere they needed to feel confident about risk-taking." His lips curved in a smile that held no mockery, only genuine appreciation. "You have a gift, Camille. What you did tonight, it was art." The compliment hit her harder than it should have. In 5 years of coordinating luxury events, she had received plenty of praise, from clients, from industry publications, from her own boss. But something about hearing those words from Ethan, spoken in the empty ballroom where they had spent the day working as partners rather than adversaries, made them feel weighted with significance. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything today. I couldn't have managed alone." "Yes, you could have," his voice was certain, "but I'm glad you didn't have to." They sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the evidence of their shared success. The ballroom's crystal chandeliers cast warm light over empty tables and scattered rose petals, creating an atmosphere that felt intimate despite the vast space. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Las Vegas glittered with its usual excess, but somehow the city's manufactured glamour felt distant compared to the quiet satisfaction of the moment. "We should head back to the suite," Camille said eventually, though she made no move to stand. The idea of returning to their shared space felt different now, less fraught with tension, more weighted with possibility. "Probably," Ethan agreed, but he didn't move either. Long day tomorrow, too. The closing breakfast, vendor wrap-up meetings. She turned to look at him more fully, noting the way the ballroom's lighting caught the strong line of his jaw, the slight smile that played around his lips. "What?" "I was just thinking," he said, his voice carrying a note of something she couldn't quite identify. "This morning you looked like you were ready to murder someone with a floral arrangement. Tonight you look..." Tired, she suggested. Beautiful. The word hung between them in the crystal-lit quiet of the empty ballroom, changing something fundamental about the space they occupied. Camille felt her breath catch, awareness prickling across her skin like electricity. Ethan, I know, he said quietly. I know this complicates everything. I know we have to work together, and I know you have every reason not to trust me. He turned in his chair to face her fully, his expression serious. But I can't pretend anymore that this is just about business. What is it about? The question came out barely above a whisper. You. The answer was immediate, certain. It's been about you since the first time we met, Camille. Every argument, every meeting, every time I've pushed your boundaries, it was because I couldn't figure out how to tell you that you're the most fascinating woman I've ever encountered. The confession hit her like a physical blow. All those months of professional warfare, all those times she had gone home frustrated and angry, wondering why he seemed to single her out for particularly intense scrutiny. He hadn't been trying to undermine her. He had been trying to understand her. That's, she started, then stopped because she wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. Pathetic, he suggested, echoing his words from the previous day. Immature? Counterproductive? Honest, she said instead. It's honest. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe, or something deeper. I've wanted to be honest with you for months, but there never seemed to be a right time, a right way to say that the woman who challenges me professionally is also the woman who what? Who makes me want to be better than I am. The admission was so unexpected, so vulnerable, that Camille felt her carefully constructed defenses crumble entirely. This was Ethan Drake, billionaire, power broker, the man who had built an empire on calculated risks and emotional distance, and he was sitting in an empty ballroom at midnight, telling her that she made him want to be better. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say anything. He reached across the small space between their chairs, his fingers finding hers with gentle certainty. But if you're willing, maybe we could figure out what this is. Together. The word together seemed to echo in the vast space of the ballroom, promising something that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Camille looked down at their joined hands, her dark skin against his lighter tone, her delicate fingers intertwined with his broader ones. The sight sent warmth spiraling through her chest in ways that had nothing to do with the ballroom's ambient lighting. This is complicated, she said finally. Yes, we work together. Sort of. Sometimes. We do. And you're... She gestured vaguely, encompassing his perfect suit, his unconscious confidence, the invisible weight of wealth that followed him everywhere. You're you. Disappointingly so, he said, with a self-deprecating smile that made him look younger, more approachable. That's not what I meant. She studied his face, noting the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, the small scar above his left eyebrow that she had noticed on the plane. I meant that you're used to getting what you want, and I'm not sure I want to be something you acquire. Camille. His voice was serious now, weighted with something that sounded like hurt. Is that really what you think? That this is about acquisition? Isn't it? The question came out sharper than she intended, but 18 months of professional warfare had taught her to be suspicious of his motives. No. The answer was immediate, certain. This is about the fact that you're the only person in my life who treats me like a human being instead of a bank account. This is about the way you fight for what you believe in, even when it's inconvenient. This is about the fact that watching you work is like watching someone create magic out of chaos. He stood up then, moving to the ballroom's windows, where Las Vegas spread out below them in all its glittering excess. I have everything money can buy, Camille, but I've never had anyone look at me the way you do when you think I'm not watching. How do I look at you? She asked, rising to join him at the window. Like you see something worth saving. The words hit her harder than any confession he could have made. Because he was right. Despite their professional antagonism, despite his arrogance and her frustration, she had always sensed something deeper in Ethan Drake. Something lonely and searching that resonated with parts of herself she kept carefully hidden. Maybe I do, she whispered. When he turned to look at her, the expression in his eyes was so raw, so vulnerable, that she felt her breath catch. This wasn't the controlled businessman or the calculated power broker. This was just a man standing in an empty ballroom, asking her to take a chance on something that could destroy them both. Camille, he said quietly, his hand rising to cup her cheek with a gentleness that belied his reputation for ruthless efficiency. May I kiss you? The question hung between them in the crystal-lit quiet, weighted with possibility and danger, and the kind of decision that changed everything. And as Las Vegas glittered below them like a constellation of earthbound stars, Camille Johnson realized that her answer had been inevitable from the moment she first met Ethan Drake. "Yes," she whispered. The kiss was everything Camille had never allowed herself to imagine, and nothing like what she had expected. Ethan's lips were soft against hers, tentative at first, as if he couldn't quite believe she had said yes. His hand remained gentle against her cheek, thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone, with a reverence that made her heart stutter in her chest. The ballroom around them, with its crystal chandeliers and scattered rose petals, faded into insignificance, as every sense focused on the man holding her like she was something precious. When they finally broke apart, Camille found herself breathless, staring up into steel-gray eyes that held wonder and something deeper, something that looked dangerously close to adoration. "That was—" she started, then stopped, because words felt inadequate for the electricity still humming through her veins. "Worth 18 months of waiting," Ethan finished, his voice rough with emotion. They stood there in the empty ballroom, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, while Las Vegas glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The silence stretched between them, filled with possibility and the weight of a decision that couldn't be undone. "We should go back to the suite," Camille whispered, though she made no move to step away from his touch. "We should," he agreed, but his thumb continued its gentle caress along her cheek. The walk to the elevator felt surreal, hyper-aware as she was of Ethan's presence beside her. His hand found hers in the empty hallway, fingers intertwining with a naturalness that belied the complexity of what had just happened between them. The elevator ride to the presidential floor passed in charged silence, each floor that ticked by bringing them closer to a conversation that would define whatever came next. The suite felt different when they entered, more intimate somehow, as if the kiss had shifted the molecular structure of the space they shared. The living area, with its elegant furniture and panoramic view of the Strip, no longer felt like neutral territory. It felt like the stage for whatever happened next. "I should shower," Camille said, suddenly aware of the long day that clung to her skin, the scent of roses and champagne, the weight of stress that had finally lifted. "It's been the longest day of my life," Ethan said quietly, in the best possible way. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and disappeared into the marble bathroom that was larger than most people's bedrooms. Under the rainfall shower, with water cascading down her dark skin, Camille tried to process what had just happened. She had kissed Ethan Drake. More than that, she had wanted to kiss him, had been thinking about it for longer than she cared to admit. When she emerged 20 minutes later, wrapped in the Bellagio's impossibly soft terry cloth robe, she found Ethan standing by the windows, still in his formal shirt and trousers, but with his bow tie discarded and his collar open. He had been waiting for her, she realized, though he turned when he heard her approach with a careful respect that made her chest ache. "Better?" he asked. "Much." She moved to stand beside him at the window, acutely aware of the space between them, close enough to catch his scent, far enough to maintain the illusion of safety. "Thank you. For today. For everything. You don't have to thank me, Camille." His voice was serious. "What happened tonight? I don't want you to think it was calculated or part of some strategy." "Wasn't it?" The question came out before she could stop it, vulnerability making her defensive. He turned to face her fully, and the expression in his eyes was so earnest it made her throat tight. "No, God, no. Do you really think I'm capable of orchestrating something like this?" She studied his face, the slight flush across his cheekbones, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the careful way he held himself as if afraid any sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile thing existed between them. "I don't know what to think," she admitted. 18 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be standing in a hotel suite with you, having this conversation, you'd have had them committed," he finished with a self-deprecating smile. "Probably." She felt her own lips curve in response. "You were my professional nemesis, Ethan, the bane of my existence, and now I can't figure out when that changed. When fighting with you started feeling less like warfare and more like foreplay," he suggested, and the word sent heat spiraling through her body in ways that had nothing to do with the shower she'd just taken. "I was going to say conversation," she said, but her voice came out breathier than intended. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the dark flecks in his grey eyes, could count the laugh lines that suggested he smiled more than his serious reputation indicated. "And what would you call this?" This conversation, right now, in a hotel suite, at 1 in the morning. His voice dropped lower with each word, making her skin prickle with awareness. "While you're wearing nothing but a robe." The observation made her suddenly, acutely aware of her state of undress. The terry cloth was thick and modest, covering her from neck to mid-thigh, but underneath she wore nothing but warm skin and the fading scent of expensive hotel soap. The realization sent heat through her body that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with the way Ethan was looking at her, like she was something he wanted to unwrap very, very slowly. "I'm being perfectly appropriate," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "You are," he agreed, moving close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Perfectly, frustratingly appropriate." "Frustrating?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "Do you have any idea," he said, his voice rough with something that made her pulse race, "how long I've wanted to touch you, really touch you, not just the careful professional contact we've managed over the past 18 months? Ethan, his name came out like a plea, though she wasn't sure what she was asking for. "I've thought about it," he continued, his hand rising to trace the line of her jaw with fingertips that trembled slightly. "Wondered if your skin is as soft as it looks. Wondered what you'd sound like if I kissed that spot right here." His thumb brushed the pulse point at her throat, making her breath catch. "Where your pulse is racing." "My pulse is not racing," she lied, even as her body betrayed her with a shiver that had nothing to do with cold. "Isn't it?" He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Because mine is. It's been racing since the moment you said yes in that ballroom." The confession undid something in her chest, some last barrier she'd been maintaining through sheer force of will, because this wasn't the controlled businessman she'd been fighting for 18 months. This was a man who was trembling slightly with want, whose careful composure was fracturing around the edges, who was looking at her like she held answers to questions he'd been asking his entire life. "What do you want, Camille?" His voice was barely above a whisper, his forehead resting against hers. "Tell me what you want." The question hung between them in the lamp-lit quiet of the suite, weighted with possibility and danger and the kind of honesty that changed everything. Outside, Las Vegas glittered with its promise that anything could happen, that reality was negotiable, that risk could pay off in ways that transformed lives. And as Camille looked into Ethan's eyes, saw the vulnerability there, the want, the careful hope, she realized that her answer had been building for 18 months, hidden beneath every argument, every challenge, every moment when their professional warfare had felt less like conflict and more like an elaborate dance around something neither of them had been brave enough to name. "I want," she whispered, her hands rising to frame his face, "to stop pretending that I don't think about you when I'm alone." The admission broke something open in his expression, relief and desire, and something deeper that made her chest ache with its intensity. "Camille," he breathed, and then his mouth was on hers again, and this time there was nothing tentative about it. This kiss was fire and demand, and 18 months of suppressed attraction finally given permission to burn. His hands tangled in her still damp hair, pulling her closer as she melted against him, every careful boundary she'd constructed dissolving under the assault of sensation. When they broke apart this time, both breathing hard, Camille realized that there was no going back from this moment. Whatever happened next would redefine everything between them, their professional relationship, their carefully maintained antagonism, the safe distance that had kept them both protected. "Are you sure?" Ethan asked, his voice rough with restraint. "Because once we cross this line—" "I know," she whispered, and found that she did. She knew exactly what this meant, exactly what she was risking, and for the first time in her carefully planned life, she didn't care about the consequences. "I'm sure." Camille woke to the soft gray light of Vegas dawn filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then awareness crashed back in waves. The Bellagio's presidential suite, the weight of a warm arm around her waist, the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something indefinably masculine that belonged to the man sleeping beside her. Ethan's breathing was deep and steady against her shoulder, his body curved protectively around hers beneath the Egyptian cotton sheets. Everything had changed. She lay perfectly still, afraid that any movement might wake him and force them both to confront what had happened between them in the lamplit intimacy of the previous night. Because what had happened, God, what had happened, had been everything she'd never allowed herself to imagine, and more than she'd thought possible. The terry-cloth robe lay discarded somewhere near the windows. Her professional armor, the carefully constructed image of Camille Johnson, successful event coordinator, had been stripped away along with her clothes, leaving her more vulnerable than she'd been with anyone in years. Ethan stirred beside her, his arm tightening unconsciously around her waist, and she felt her breath catch. In sleep, with his dark hair mussed and his face relaxed, he looked younger, less like the controlled businessman who had been her professional nemesis, and more like the man who had whispered her name, like a prayer against her skin. "You're thinking too loud," he murmured without opening his eyes, his voice rough with sleep and something that sounded dangerously close to contentment. "How do you know I'm thinking?" "Because I can feel the tension in every muscle of your body." His thumb traced lazy circles against her hip bone, a gesture so intimate and possessive that it sent heat spiraling through her despite the morning's uncertainty. "Also, you've been holding your breath for the past 5 minutes. She exhaled slowly, hyper-aware of the way her body moved against his with even that simple action. "I wasn't sure if you were awake." "I've been awake since sunrise." He finally opened his eyes, steel-gray gaze finding hers with an intensity that made her chest tight. "Watching you sleep. That's not creepy at all," she said, but there was no heat in the words. If anything, the admission made something warm unfurl in her stomach, the idea that he had been content to simply watch her, that he found something worth studying in her unguarded face. "You're beautiful when you sleep," he said simply. "No walls, no professional armor, just you." The observation was too honest, too vulnerable for the harsh light of morning, and Camille felt herself retreating behind familiar defenses. "We should probably talk about what happened," he finished quietly. "About what this means. Does it have to mean anything?" The question came out sharper than she intended, but panic was starting to claw at the edges of her consciousness. In the warm darkness of the previous night, giving in to 18 months of suppressed attraction had felt inevitable. Right. But morning brought responsibilities, consequences, the stark reality of their professional relationship. Something shifted in Ethan's expression, a carefully controlled blankness that she recognized from their business meetings. "Is that what you want? For this to not mean anything?" "I want—" she started, then stopped, because she wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. What did she want? To pretend last night hadn't happened? To return to their professional antagonism as if she hadn't discovered that Ethan Drake made love with the same intensity he brought to business negotiations, as if her name on his lips hadn't sounded like both question and answer. "I want to not complicate things," she said finally. "Too late for that." His voice was gentle but implacable. "Things got complicated the moment you said yes in that ballroom." He was right, and they both knew it. There was no going back to the careful distance they had maintained for 18 months. No way to unknow what they now knew about each other. The professional boundaries that had defined their relationship had been not just crossed but obliterated. Camille sat up, clutching the sheet to her chest, with sudden modesty that felt ridiculous given what they had shared. The movement put distance between them, but she could still feel the warmth of his gaze on her bare shoulders, still catch his scent on the expensive hotel linens. "We work together," she said, her voice taking on the clipped professionalism that had served her well in 5 years of event coordination. "Sort of, sometimes, and now we've made love," he finished when she couldn't find the words. The phrase hit her harder than it should have. Because that's what it had been, hadn't it? Not just sex, not just the release of 18 months of tension, but something deeper and more dangerous. The way he had touched her, the way he had whispered her name, the way he had looked at her, as if she held answers to questions he'd been asking his entire life. That hadn't been casual or meaningless. "Ethan, I'm not sorry," he said, sitting up to face her properly. The sheet pooled around his waist, and she tried not to notice the way morning light played across the lean muscles of his chest, tried not to remember how those muscles had felt under her hands. "I should be. It complicates everything. It changes our entire professional dynamic. It probably violates at least 6 different codes of conduct, but I'm not sorry." "You should be," she said quietly, "because this can't happen again." The words hung between them in the suite's luxurious quiet, and she watched something die in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or the careful contentment she had seen there moments before. "Can't or won't?" he asked. "Does it matter?" "Yes." He reached for her then, his hand covering hers where it gripped the sheet. "It matters because can't suggests external circumstances, and won't suggests choice, and I need to know which one we're dealing with." The distinction was too perceptive, too close to the heart of her panic, because the truth was that she wanted it to happen again, wanted to wake up every morning in his arms, wanted to explore the tender intensity she'd discovered beneath his controlled exterior, wanted to see where this impossible thing between them might lead, and that want terrified her more than any professional consequence. "I've worked too hard to get where I am," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "5 years of building my reputation, of proving that I belong in rooms full of powerful men who see me as either a threat or a conquest. I can't afford to be seen as someone who sleeps with clients." "Is that what you think you are?" His voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the hurt underneath. "A conquest? I don't know what I am," she admitted, and the honesty of it made her voice crack. "Last night I felt, God, Ethan, I felt like the only woman in the world. But this morning, I feel like I've made a mistake that could destroy everything I've built." He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not respond. Outside their windows, Las Vegas was waking up, traffic starting to move along the strip, early morning joggers appearing in the distance, the city preparing for another day of manufactured dreams and calculated risks. "What if," he said finally, his voice very gentle, "instead of thinking about what this destroys, we thought about what it might build?" The suggestion was too tempting, too full of possibility that felt dangerous to someone who had learned to plan every aspect of her life with military precision. "I don't know how to do that," she whispered. "Neither do I." His thumb traced across her knuckles, and the simple contact sent warmth shooting up her arm. "But maybe we could figure it out, together." There was that word again, together, promising partnership and shared risk, and the kind of vulnerability that came from trusting someone else with your carefully constructed dreams. "The summit ends today," she said, grasping for practical concerns. "We go back to Los Angeles, back to our separate lives, back to what, Camille? Back to pretending we're enemies. Back to professional meetings where we both remember exactly how you look when you don't." The word came out sharp enough to cut. "Don't make this harder than it already is." "I'm not trying to make it hard." His voice softened. "I'm trying to make it real." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed on the nightstand, the sharp, insistent sound of someone calling at an hour when calls meant emergencies. She reached for it gratefully, needing the distraction from the impossible conversation they were having. "Vivian," she answered, noting her boss's name on the caller ID. "Camille, darling, I hope I'm not waking you." Vivian's voice was bright with the kind of energy that suggested she'd been up for hours, probably reviewing profit margins and client satisfaction surveys. "I've been getting calls all morning about last night's event. Apparently, Henderson Industries is so impressed, they want to discuss a year-long partnership with Prestige Events." "That's..." Camille glanced at Ethan, who was listening with obvious interest. "That's wonderful news." "It is indeed. And apparently they specifically requested that you remain the primary coordinator for any future events. Something about your exceptional partnership with Ethan Drake." There was something in Vivian's tone that suggested she knew more than she was saying. "I trust that partnership went smoothly." Camille felt heat rise in her cheeks as she met Ethan's amused gaze. "Very smoothly," she managed. "Excellent. I'll need you back in the office Monday morning to discuss the details. This could be career-defining, Camille, for both of us." The call ended, leaving them alone with the weight of implication and opportunity and the complicated reality of what had happened between them. "Well," Ethan said quietly, "looks like we'll be seeing more of each other." "Looks like it," she agreed, though her voice sounded uncertain even to her own ears. Because as Las Vegas glittered beyond their windows, promising that anything could happen to those brave enough to take the risk, Camille realized that the biggest gamble of her life wasn't the client partnership or the career opportunity. It was the man beside her, who was looking at her like she held the key to something he'd been searching for his entire life. 3 weeks had passed since Las Vegas, and Camille Johnson was slowly going insane. She sat in the conference room of Prestige Events, surrounded by vendor contracts and venue photographs for the Henderson Industries quarterly gala, trying to focus on seating arrangements while her mind wandered to steel-gray eyes and the memory of hands that had mapped every inch of her skin with reverent precision. "The Henderson executives prefer the west side of the ballroom," Natalie Pemberton was saying, her voice seeming to come from very far away. "Better acoustics for the presentations." "Fine," Camille murmured, making a note she would probably forget to implement. Everything felt distant lately, as if she were operating through a layer of emotional static that made ordinary tasks feel monumentally difficult. Her phone buzzed on the polished conference table, a text from an unknown number, but she knew who it was before she opened it. "Thinking of you." 3 words that shouldn't have had the power to make her pulse race, but did anyway. It was the 7th message he'd sent in 3 weeks. Never pushy, never demanding, just simple acknowledgements of her existence that felt like lifelines thrown across an ocean of professional distance. She hadn't responded to any of them. "Camille?" Natalie's voice cut through her reverie. "The catering proposal." "Right. Yes." Camille forced herself to focus on the documents spread before her. Brookhaven Catering submitted their menu yesterday. 5 courses. Emphasis on locally sourced ingredients. "And what did Mr. Drake think of their proposal?" Natalie asked innocently, though there was something in her tone that suggested the question wasn't as casual as it appeared. Camille's pen stilled against the contract. "I haven't discussed it with him yet." "Really? That's unusual. You two have been in constant communication on every Henderson project for the past 6 months." The observation was accurate and uncomfortable. Before Las Vegas, Camille and Ethan had maintained regular contact about every aspect of their collaborative events. Emails, phone calls, the occasional contentious meeting that somehow always resulted in better outcomes than either of them achieved alone. But 3 weeks ago, that communication had stopped entirely, at least from her end. "I'm sure his assistant will coordinate any necessary approvals," Camille said, her voice carrying the brisk professionalism that had become her armor against the growing ache in her chest. Natalie studied her with the calculating gaze of someone who had worked in luxury event planning, long enough to read between the lines of client relationships. "Is everything all right between you two? Because Henderson Industries specifically requested that you maintain the same collaborative approach that made the Vegas summit so successful." "Everything is fine," Camille lied smoothly. "Mr. Drake and I maintain a strictly professional relationship." The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but they were safer than the truth, that she thought about Ethan Drake every morning when she woke up alone, every evening when she returned to her empty apartment, every time she caught his cologne on a stranger's suit jacket, that she had been fighting the urge to call him for 3 weeks, knowing that hearing his voice would destroy the careful distance she'd constructed between Las Vegas and real life. Her phone buzzed again. Another text. "I miss you." 2 words that hit her like a physical blow, making it suddenly difficult to breathe in the air-conditioned conference room. She set the phone face down on the table with movements that were carefully controlled, but Natalie's sharp eyes missed nothing. "Camille, perhaps you should take a break. You look—" "I'm fine," Camille interrupted, but even she could hear the strain in her voice. "Let's finish reviewing these contracts." For the next hour, she managed to maintain focus on vendor negotiations and timeline coordination, the familiar rhythm of event planning providing temporary refuge from the chaos in her chest. But when the meeting ended, and she was alone in her office, the silence felt oppressive. She picked up her phone, staring at Ethan's messages with a longing that made her throat tight. 3 weeks of radio silence, and he was still reaching out, still hoping for something she was too afraid to give. Before she could lose her nerve, she typed back, "We need to talk." His response came immediately, as if he'd been waiting by his phone. When and where? The speed of his reply made something twist in her chest. Relief and terror, and a dangerous flutter of hope she couldn't afford to acknowledge. "Tonight, 7 p.m., Griffith Observatory parking lot." She chose the location deliberately, public enough to feel safe, private enough for the conversation they needed to have. The observatory had always been her refuge when Los Angeles felt too overwhelming, a place where the city's glittering sprawl looked manageable from a distance. "I'll be there." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of nervous energy and second-guessing. By 6:30, Camille was driving up the winding road to Griffith Observatory, her hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. She had changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater that she told herself had nothing to do with the way Ethan had once said she looked beautiful in soft colors. She arrived first, parking overlooking the sprawling city below. Los Angeles glittered in the gathering dusk, millions of lights creating patterns that looked almost like stars if you squinted and believed in the possibility of magic. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of eucalyptus from the nearby trails and the distant promise of rain. At exactly 7 o'clock, she heard the familiar rumble of an expensive engine. Ethan's black Tesla pulled into the space beside hers, and for a moment neither of them moved. Through their respective windows, she could see his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel as if he were preparing for battle. Finally he got out, and she followed suit, the cool evening air raising goosebumps along her arms that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the man walking toward her with careful, measured steps. He looked good, too good if she were being honest. His dark jeans and charcoal sweater made him look younger, more approachable than the formal business attire she was used to. His hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and there were shadows under his eyes that suggested she wasn't the only one who had been sleeping poorly. "Thank you for coming," she said, when he was close enough to hear her over the distant hum of city traffic. "Thank you for asking." His voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in the way he held himself, as if he were braced for disappointment. "I wasn't sure you would." They stood there in the parking lot, two people who had shared the most intimate parts of themselves, and were now struggling to find common ground in the aftermath. Around them, other visitors moved between cars and viewing areas, couples holding hands and families pointing out constellations in the emerging stars. "I've been thinking," Camille began, then stopped because the words felt inadequate for the complexity of what she needed to say. "About?" His voice was gentle, encouraging, and she remembered why she had fallen for him in the first place. Beneath the corporate armor and calculated confidence, Ethan Drake was fundamentally kind. "About what you said. In Vegas. About building something instead of destroying it." Something shifted in his expression. Hope, maybe, or the careful beginning of relief. And I've been terrified," she admitted, the honesty feeling both freeing and dangerous. "Terrified of what people will think, terrified of how it changes our professional relationship, terrified of what?" he prompted when she trailed off. "Of how much I want it," she whispered. "How much I want you." The confession hung between them in the crisp October air, weighted with 3 weeks of suppressed longing, and the kind of truth that changed everything. Ethan took a step closer, close enough that she could see the way her words affected him, the way his breathing deepened, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, as if he were fighting the urge to reach for her. "Camille," he said, her name sounding like both prayer and promise, "do you have any idea what these past 3 weeks have been like for me?" "Probably similar to what they've been like for me," she said with a shaky laugh. "Miserable, distracting, full of regret and second-guessing and missing someone I'm supposed to be professionally antagonistic toward." "We were never really antagonistic," he said quietly. "We were dancing around something neither of us knew how to name. And now? Now I know what to call it." His hand rose to cup her cheek, thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone with the same reverence she remembered from their night in Vegas. "Love. I call it love." The word hit her like lightning, illuminating everything she had been too afraid to acknowledge. Because that's what this was, wasn't it? This ache that had settled in her chest, this constant awareness of his absence, this feeling that she was only half herself when he wasn't around. "Ethan, I love you," he continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I love your intelligence, your dedication, the way you fight for what you believe in. I love the way you look when you're solving impossible problems, and I love the way you sound when you say my name. I love you enough to wait as long as it takes for you to trust that this is real." Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them, tears of relief and fear and a happiness so sharp it felt like breaking. "I love you too," she whispered. "God help me. I love you too." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise, transforming his features from careful control to pure joy. "Really, really." She laughed, despite the tears, despite the terror, despite the complete upheaval of everything she thought she knew about her carefully planned life. "I love you, and it's terrifying, and I have no idea how we make this work, but—" He kissed her then, cutting off her worried rambling with lips that tasted like hope and promises, and the kind of future she had never allowed herself to imagine. Around them, Los Angeles glittered like a galaxy of earthbound stars, and for the first time in 3 weeks, Camille Johnson felt like she could breathe again. When they broke apart, foreheads touching, breathing the same air beneath the emerging constellations, she realized that some risks were worth taking, even the ones that changed everything. 6 months later, Camille Johnson stood in the ballroom of the Beverly Hills Hotel, watching 300 guests celebrate the most successful Henderson Industries gala in company history, and marveled at how completely her life had transformed. The event was flawless, every detail executed with the precision that had built her reputation, every guest satisfied, every vendor performing at their peak. But for the first time in her career, the professional triumph felt secondary to something else entirely. The man across the room who was watching her, with an expression of such pure admiration that it made her chest tight with happiness. Ethan Drake had been different since that night at Griffith Observatory, more open, more present, more willing to let the world see past the carefully constructed facade of the successful businessman. Tonight, He wore his formal tuxedo with the same unconscious elegance as always, but there was something in his posture that spoke of contentment rather than control. Their relationship had been the subject of considerable speculation in Los Angeles business circles. Vivian had been delighted by the professional opportunities it created. Henderson Industries had increased their contract by 40%, and the society pages had breathlessly covered every public appearance of the power couple that no one saw coming. But the real story, the late-night conversations, the quiet Sunday mornings, the way he brought her coffee exactly how she liked it without being asked, that belonged to them alone. "Ms. Johnson?" A familiar voice interrupted her reverie. She turned to find Cordelia Ashworth, the society reporter, whose coverage could make or break reputations in their circle. "Might I have a word?" Camille smiled with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to navigate media attention. "Of course, Ms. Ashworth. The gala is absolutely stunning tonight. Tell me, what's next for the Johnson-Drake partnership, both professional and personal?" The question was loaded with implication, and Camille felt her pulse quicken. For weeks, she had been fielding similar inquiries with diplomatic non-answers, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the kind of evening where secrets couldn't be kept much longer. "I'm afraid you'll have to ask Mr. Drake about that," she said carefully. As if summoned by her words, Ethan appeared at her side with the silent grace that had once irritated her and now felt like coming home. His hand found the small of her back, a gesture so natural, so possessive, that it sent warmth spiraling through her despite the familiarity. "Ask me about what?" he said, his voice carrying the hint of amusement that had replaced his old antagonistic edge. "The future of your partnership," Cordelia said with the predatory smile of someone who sensed a story brewing. "Our partnership," Ethan repeated, his eyes finding Camille's with an intensity that made her breath catch, "is about to enter a new phase." Before Camille could ask what he meant, the orchestra began playing a waltz that seemed to signal the end of formal presentations and the beginning of dancing. Around them, couples moved onto the polished floor with the fluid grace of people accustomed to luxury and spectacle. "Dance with me," Ethan said, extending his hand with old-world courtesy. "I should check with the caterers about dessert service," Camille replied automatically. But even as she spoke, she was taking his hand. "The caterers can manage without you for one song," he said, leading her onto the dance floor with the confident steps of someone who had been attending formal events since childhood. As they moved together, his hand warm against her waist, her fingers intertwined with his, Camille felt the familiar magic that happened whenever they touched. The ballroom around them seemed to fade, 300 guests becoming background to the man who held her like she was something precious. "You've been quiet tonight," she murmured, noting the slight tension in his shoulders despite his relaxed demeanor. "Nervous," he admitted, his breath warm against her ear as they swayed to the music. "You? Nervous? About what?" "About whether you'll say yes." The cryptic answer made her pull back to study his face, noting the carefully controlled expression that couldn't quite hide the vulnerability beneath. Yes to what? Instead of answering, he spun her gently, and when she came back to him, something had changed in his eyes. A decision made, a line crossed, a moment of truth arriving whether they were ready or not. "Camille," he said, his voice carrying across the music with quiet intensity, "do you remember what I told you in Las Vegas? About wanting to build something instead of destroying it?" "Yes," she whispered, though her voice came out barely audible over the orchestra. "I've been thinking about what we could build together, not just professionally but personally, something permanent, something that doesn't end when the contracts are signed or the events are over." Her heart began beating so hard, she was certain he could feel it against his chest. Around them, other couples continued dancing, but she felt as if they were alone in a bubble of possibility and anticipation. "Ethan," she started, but he was already moving, releasing her hand to reach into his jacket pocket. What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. Ethan Drake, billionaire, power broker, the man who had once been her greatest professional adversary, dropped to one knee in the middle of the Beverly Hills Hotel ballroom, pulling out a ring box that caught the crystal chandelier light like captured stars. The music stopped. Conversations ceased. 300 guests turned to stare at the couple in the center of the dance floor, but Camille was only aware of steel-gray eyes looking up at her with a mixture of terror and hope that made her throat close with emotion. "Camille Johnson," he said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence with perfect clarity, "you are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known. You challenge me, you inspire me, and you make me want to be better than I ever thought possible. I love your intelligence, your strength, your dedication to everything you do. I love the way you fight for what you believe in, and I love the way you've taught me that the best partnerships are built on respect, not conquest." He opened the ring box, revealing a stunning solitaire diamond that seemed to hold all the light in the room. "Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me? Will you let me spend the rest of my existence proving that some enemies are just lovers who haven't figured it out yet?" The silence stretched across the ballroom like held breath. 300 witnesses waiting for her answer to a question that would define the rest of her life. Camille looked down at the man kneeling before her, this complicated, brilliant, impossible man who had somehow become the center of her carefully ordered world, and felt everything click into place with startling clarity. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, with the kind of joy that couldn't be contained. "Yes, Ethan Drake, I will marry you." The ballroom exploded in applause as he slipped the ring onto her finger, with hands that trembled slightly despite his usual composure. When he stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that was entirely inappropriate for a professional event and absolutely perfect for a moment that changed everything, Camille realized that sometimes the best love stories began with the worst first impressions. "I love you," she said against his lips, not caring that half of Los Angeles society was watching them with fascination and barely concealed envy. "I love you too," he replied, his forehead resting against hers as they stood in the center of the dance floor, surrounded by applause and camera flashes and the kind of attention that would make headlines in tomorrow's society pages. "I love you enough to spend the rest of my life proving it." As the orchestra resumed playing and other couples joined them on the dance floor, Camille thought about the journey that had brought them here. From professional enemies to reluctant partners, to lovers to this moment of promise and possibility. It hadn't been easy and it certainly hadn't been predictable, but as she looked into the eyes of her former adversary and future husband, she realized that the best love stories were rarely simple. They were complicated and messy and full of challenges that tested every assumption about what love was supposed to look like. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, they ended with a proposal in a ballroom full of witnesses, with a man who had learned to see strength instead of stubbornness, partnership instead of conquest, and love instead of war. "So," Ethan said as they swayed together beneath the crystal chandeliers, "ready to plan the wedding of the century?" Camille laughed, thinking of vendor negotiations and timeline coordination, and all the professional challenges that would come with planning her own wedding while building a life with the man who held her like she was his most precious investment. "Bring it on, Mr. Drake," she said. "Bring it on." And as Los Angeles glittered beyond the ballroom windows like a constellation of earthbound dreams, Camille Johnson, soon to be Camille Johnson Drake, realized that sometimes the greatest risk was also the greatest reward. 2 years later, the morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Malibu home, casting golden patterns across the hardwood floors where Camille Drake sat cross-legged in her favorite oversized sweater, wedding planning folders scattered around her like fallen leaves. Mrs. Camille Drake. Even after 18 months of marriage, the name still made her smile. "The Whitmore Anniversary Gala needs final approval on the centerpieces," she murmured to herself, making notes in the margins of vendor contracts. At 29, she had built prestige events into the most sought-after luxury coordination company on the West Coast, but success had never felt as sweet as it did when shared with someone who understood the cost of ambition. "Working on a Saturday again," Ethan's voice carried from the kitchen, warm with affection and only mild reproach. "The Whitmores are celebrating 50 years of marriage. The details have to be perfect." She looked up to find her husband approaching with 2 cups of coffee, his dark hair still mussed from sleep, wearing nothing but gray sweatpants, and the kind of contentment that came from knowing exactly where he belonged. "Everything you do is perfect," he said, settling beside her on the Persian rug they'd bought together during their honeymoon in Morocco. "But even perfection can take a Saturday morning break." He handed her the coffee, prepared exactly how she liked it, with a dash of cinnamon and just enough cream to soften the edge, and pressed a kiss to her temple that felt like coming home. "How's the Morocco project coming along?" she asked, leaning into his warmth as she sipped the perfectly prepared coffee. "The Children's Hospital Foundation is ahead of schedule. We should be ready to break ground next month." His voice carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who had learned to use his wealth for more than acquisition. "Kendra thinks we can have the first wing operational within 2 years." Camille smiled, thinking of the man she had married. Still brilliant, still driven, but now channeling his considerable talents toward building something meaningful rather than simply accumulating more. The Children's Hospital in Morocco would be the third international facility funded by the Drake Foundation, and each one carried a small plaque acknowledging the woman who had taught him that true power lay in partnership, not conquest. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly, the words carrying the weight of genuine admiration. "I learned from the best." His hand found hers, thumb tracing the wedding band that matched his own. Simple platinum bands they'd chosen together, elegant and understated in a way that felt true to who they had become. "Speaking of which, how do you feel about adding another project to our list?" "Another hospital, of course, if you think—" "Not a hospital," he interrupted, his voice carrying a note of something that made her look up from her coffee with sudden attention. "Something smaller, more personal. Something that would require a 9-month timeline and considerable lifestyle adjustments." The meaning of his words hit her like lightning, making the coffee cup tremble in her hands. "Ethan, I know we said we'd wait another year," he continued, his steel grey eyes holding the same vulnerability she remembered from their first kiss in that Las Vegas ballroom. "But watching you coordinate the Henderson family reunion last month, seeing you with their children, God, Camille, I want that. I want our children running through this house. I want to teach them about building things that matter. I want to watch you plan birthday parties with the same intensity you bring to million-dollar galas." She set down her coffee with carefully controlled movements, processing the enormity of what he was suggesting. A baby, their baby. The idea sent warmth spiraling through her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun streaming through their windows. "Are you asking me if I'm ready to start a family?" she said quietly. "I'm asking if you think the world is ready for a little person who has your determination and my stubbornness," he said, with a smile that transformed his features from careful control to pure joy. "Because I've been thinking about it, and that combination might just change everything." Camille looked around their living room, at the wedding photos scattered across the mantel, at the comfortable furniture they'd chosen together, at the evidence of a life built on partnership and mutual respect, and the kind of love that had grown stronger through challenge rather than weaker. "The timing isn't perfect," she said, thinking of client obligations and event schedules and the careful planning that had governed her life for so long. "When has timing ever been perfect for us?" Ethan pointed out. "We got together during the most complicated professional period of both our careers. We got engaged in front of 300 witnesses without discussing it beforehand. We planned our own wedding while coordinating 6 other events simultaneously, and it all worked out," she said, remembering the beautiful chaos of their first year together, "because we worked together." His hand moved to cup her cheek with the same reverence that had undone her defenses 2 years ago in a Las Vegas hotel suite. "We're good at figuring things out as we go, Camille. We always have been." She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes and letting herself imagine it, a child with his eyes and her smile, teaching them about hard work and kindness and the importance of fighting for what mattered. The image felt both terrifying and perfect, like everything else about their relationship. "Yes," she whispered, opening her eyes to find him watching her with an expression of such hope that it made her throat tight. "Yes, I want that. I want our children. I want the beautiful chaos. I want to see what we build together." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise, transforming the morning light into something that felt magical rather than ordinary. He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and full of promises about the future they would create together. "I love you, Mrs. Drake," he murmured against her lips. "I love you too," she replied, thinking of the journey that had brought them here, from professional enemies to reluctant partners, to lovers, to spouses, to this moment of new possibility, "even when you interrupt my work on Saturday mornings." "Especially then," he said, gathering the wedding planning folders and setting them aside to pull her more fully into his arms. "Because Saturday mornings are for dreaming about the future, not working." As they lay together on the Persian rug in the golden Malibu morning, surrounded by the life they had built through challenge and compromise, and the kind of love that transformed enemies into allies, Camille thought about the woman she had been 3 years ago. Determined, independent, certain that love was a luxury she couldn't afford. That woman could never have imagined this moment, this contentment, this feeling that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right person. Sometimes the greatest victories came not from winning the war, but from discovering that the enemy you'd been fighting was actually the partner you'd been searching for all along. And sometimes, if you were very brave and very lucky, That discovery led to Saturday morning conversations about building a family, planning the future, and creating something that would last long after the contracts were signed and the events were over. "So," Ethan said, his voice warm with laughter and possibility, "ready to plan the most important project of our lives?" Camille smiled, thinking of prenatal vitamins and nursery designs and all the beautiful complications that came with creating life with someone you loved beyond reason. "Bring it on, Mr. Drake," she said, echoing the words she'd spoken on the night he proposed. "Bring it on." And as the Pacific Ocean sparkled beyond their windows, like a promise of endless possibility, Camille and Ethan Drake began planning their greatest collaboration yet. Not an event that would last a single evening, but a legacy that would span generations. Because the best love stories, they had learned, never really end. They just begin new chapters. The end. Thank you for following Camille and Ethan's journey from enemies to lovers. What did you think of their story? Have you ever found love in the most unexpected place? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.